Nailing the perfect marriage of story to gameplay is a science that many developers still struggle with today. Bioshock has left an indelible mark on gaming narrative that can be seen and felt in many modern releases, but Irrational's motto remained from the beginning: don't start with the story, start with the gameplay. A lot of fans probably wonder about the process you go through in writing the story and the design for a game like Bioshock. You've talked about how it evolves over time and what eventually ships is very different than your initial vision. Do you guys write like a script or a design document for the game and that becomes sort of the Bible that everyone drives towards, or do you iterate much more?
It's different for every game. Like System Shock 2, I went back to it recently. I wrote a design document, and we started that project in September, and the design document I saw was dated like October or something. So in a month, I wrote the design document, and it didn't change. A lot of it, got expanded upon, but the basic design really didn't change on that. Where on Bioshock, I think it evolved in real time much more. We had a pretty substantial design shift, like a year before the ship date.
For Bioshock?
Bioshock, yeah. It got to be much more about the experience of being in Rapture than about being in your character sheet. And so the game evolved more towards that experiential kind of thing and making sure every idea was expressed in the world as well as just on your character sheet. So before you'd have a lot of things like, oh, I'm doing fire damage or electrical damage, but that was sort of a number flying off ahead versus, the whole notion of there's barrels and you light them on fire and then you can pick them up and throw them.
But you'd have stats coming off characters and all that stuff?
Much more so.
Oh, really?
And that evolved, sort of, we did a design shift, but I don't know how well that got documented. I think we were moving so fast that we were just sort of changing things, laying down the tracks as we went right ahead of us. And the same with the screenplay, the screenplay there is no screenplay. It's a bunch of probably Excel files and fragments of Word documents that I'd write and I'd go to recording sessions and I'd rewrite on the fly once I hear the actor perform, because once the actor takes on it, you listen to their voice and you say, what you wrote doesn't really matter. What is the right thing for this actor playing this role to be saying? So I tend to do a lot of rewriting in the session. And then you have a bug late at night where somebody says, oh, this doesn't make any sense. And you're like, oh God, and you have to write a new audio log and try to get the actor back in. Or you figure out what's the best way to get this idea across? Yeah. And is it an audio log? Is it a poster on the wall? Is it a piece of text that pops up on the screen? That's always depending on how much time you have and what actor availability is. So, the plans sort of fall apart. I think we've worked on that a bunch since on the new project we're working on, where we are trying to document things a lot better and keep things a lot more logical, but the train was running so fast on Bioshock that we just sort of...
early on, we got the Andrew Ryan scene in, like we'd said before, and that was kind of like the keystone. We're going to put a lot of work into this, so this can't change. Everything that happens before or after that don't really involve a lot of departments working together to make a scene, those things are very malleable, and if you need to change audio logs to represent a story, if you need to add lines or take away lines, that's very doable. And I think for a while we even had text-to-speech.
We even did that, I remember for Infinite with Booker and Elizabeth and all their dialogue, and that really didn't work very well, because you'd have these dramatic scenes and it'd be like, Elizabeth, we need to go to Comstock, and it just... Yeah. It almost had no value as far as I was concerned.
Atlas radioed on ahead. Says you were looking for an invite to the fisheries. Nuts, I say. But if your heads up to the Wharf Master's office and find old Peach on research camera, maybe I could manage an invite.
Ken has so much of, these games in his head, and you're sort of, you can keep it all straight, or try to, with all the different things and changes. But from the team perspective, Sean, because this is evolving and Ken's thinking in his head about how this all ties together, how does the team sort of keep up with, what the whole game is going to look like?
There's a lot of specifics that can change. For instance, Atlas used to have a Southern drawl.
Right.
And then we recast to the Irish.
And we actually cast an actor, wrote the lines, did the whole thing, and realized that people hated that character and distrusted him from the first start. So we had to rewrite him, recast him, redo everything.
Yeah. From a team perspective, you kind of get a sense on which things are going to be really volatile and that you probably want to push off till later, because if you work on it now, it might change. Larger themes don't tend to change too much, meaning we knew we were in Rapture, we knew we had Big Daddies, we knew we had Little Sisters, we knew we had Splicers, we knew what the arc of the story was about Jack coming into Rapture, and the specifics of this radiolog versus that radiolog didn't really affect anyone outside the audio team at that time, because we could still build the environment. We still knew what the environment was. We still knew what the animations were. There are areas you learn just by working in the same space for a while that this scene, I'm not touching this yet because I know that it's going to get changed a lot. I think these themes are pretty nailed down, so I'm going to focus the team on getting these things done.
I won't leave you twisting in the wind. We're going to need to draw out of hiding, but you're going to have to trust me.
The audio logs were, a great part of the game, and something that if you're a true fan, I mean, people really go in and listen to those and piece that all together. But I imagine there's a lot of work that goes into deciding, well, this is better for an audio log versus game dialogue, and there's the act of sort of cutting back and sort of saying, we need to be clear about what the narrative is for the game. What was that process like? I mean, the audio logs, were there things you added at the end, or were those, ideas that you had for the game, but then said, hey, maybe we'd demote these a little bit and make them audio logs?
As Sean was saying, there's sort of a hierarchy of expense that you have to face, and so any ideas you have to get across, especially as you start playing the game, you realize, well, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. You have to figure out how you can introduce that idea. And generally, as the train is moving, you try to think of cheaper and cheaper ways to get those ideas across. If it's less important, it goes to an audio log. If it's less important, it goes to a poster on the wall.
Well, there's also characters that you can bring in that have audio logs that aren't, Atlas, Tenenbaum, those are your big ones. You can bring in somebody to do a short, a few different audio logs. It's a character that some players may not even find, but
right.
It adds a little bit of depth to Rapture.
And it also, usually each character generally is about a certain idea, and we don't just sort of come up with characters, we have an idea problem that we need to solve, and so let's introduce a character who's this guy, and he will be the guy who sort of shepherds you through that idea.
Julie, my dear, I am trying to run a business here. You want to spend time with my honeybees? Well, I'm going to have to start charging you for the pleasure. If I come out one more time and find you lolling out there amongst my hives, I'm grabbing my shotgun. As to your question, yes, my days in beekeeping school are a blur. But I do seem to remember something about that enzyme you keep blabbing on about.
So as you're going through the game and, writing things, rewriting things, were there things with the original Bioshock that you've always been surprised that more people didn't pick up on, or was there something that, a connection to a character you thought was really going to resonate with people, which, didn't? Anything like that?
No, it's the opposite. I was amazed, I don't know how you felt, but I was amazed how many people connected to the Would You Kindly stuff. Because I think it was when I wrote that speech, I don't think anybody on the team was like, oh my God, this is really this or that. And I don't think I really had any sense that people were going to connect to it. I think we ended up sort of over time finding more ways to support the notion throughout the game.
Yep.
And I don't think I really, until I heard Pat put together the revelation moment, where it's where you had all the bits that Atlas had said to you in the past building up, and then there was a visual that went along with that. That's when I realized it was going to be a really powerful moment. But even so, I still did I think people were really going to connect to it or really even understand it? Because it's pretty out there. And that it was meta commentary, too. I think that completely, I think I thought oh, it's kind of meta, cool. But people connected to it in a much bigger way.
Yeah, the choice to age and everything, and also just, being able to kind of roll back and think of all those other moments throughout the game. And so, a great revelation like that, they're few and far between in games where you sort of then you want to play it again, you're just oh wow, really, that does all make sense, right?
Yeah, I think as a team, we were definitely proud of what we had done. But up till that point, SWAT 4 was the biggest game that we worked on, and we had no expectation of that anybody would pick this up. Or even Bioshock cosplay. I remember the first cosplay I saw with the guy in the Big Daddy suit, and his little daughter was in the kitchen cabinet. I think that was the first one I saw. I was like, whoa, people know this stuff, that's insane.
Yeah, people were building these outfits, and that only expanded with Infinite. I mean, that sort of went crazy with Infinite, with people cosplaying Elizabeth and Luteces and Booker. It meant a lot to people, and I don't think that's something we ever saw coming, and we're deeply grateful for it, because it's one thing to make a game and get good reviews and stuff like that. It's another thing to have things that people are having their weddings themed around it, and their tattoos and naming their children after characters. You can't plan for that, and I think the only way that could happen is if you just make something that you're deeply in love with and passionate about. I can say we were. It was something there's a lot of passion on the team about, but we didn't know people were going to take away what they did.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Part of the challenge with that, though, is when people love fiction so much and they dive into every word written in every audio log and try and connect all the fiction, make sure it all makes sense. Are there any things from that game that you sort of look back and say, like, oh wow, like we didn't explain this and we should have, or things that fans have misinterpreted over the years?
There are things we think that we did that should have or shouldn't have been in the game. Like I was never a fan of having two endings, and I think
that's what the publisher was asking you to sort of have a.
That was the one thing that 2K, and they were very hands off. That was the one thing they insisted on, and it's not something I really thought was a good idea, because they're still limited, even though they're multiple. They're still limited, and so that was something that we ended up doing. One of the endings was far better than the other one. I mean, there's no. It's clear that I was much more interested in the happier ending with the little sisters than I was with the nuclear submarine ending.
I'm sure part of it was the idea that if this game is, if you're making a choice throughout it, I'm sure when some people are like, oh well, then it has to be a payoff, right?
Right. Except the game was really about lack
of
of choice.
About
not being a choice. So that always struck me as a tension that was weird. But look, at the end of the day, they were putting up a lot of money, and so I can't really complain. They weren't dictatorial at all during the development. So that was the one thing. But that's a game that I wouldn't have put the boss battle in, the final boss battle. Like we seem to end up doing that over and over and over again. Every time we start a project, I'm like, I'm never going to do that again. We're never going to do that again, and we end up doing it.
Right.
We're not good at boss battles, and that you're fighting that guy, and look, this is the naked dude. It just doesn't work.
Totally makes sense.
But and it works pretty well up till then, but then it doesn't. It just doesn't work. That boss battle's silly.
Rapture is filled corner to corner with detail and history, and the cast of characters that occupy this world are no less dynamic. Every splicer, every level boss has a story. In many ways, these characters are a reflection of their environment, and their environment a reflection of their character.
Let's talk about some of the characters in Bioshock. There's so many that fans love, and there are many Wikia pages about them. One thing that I think a lot of fans may not realize is you were telling stories with these characters, a decade ago. And technology today, as we saw in a game like Infinite, you can do amazing things with facial expressions and storytelling. Conveying that emotion that you did 10 years ago with limited technology was challenging. How hard was it back in the day to sort of, convey story in engine?
We had such a small team that we had to show Tenenbaum or Atlas. They were just splicer models, right?
Yeah. Tenenbaum was Ladysmith, which is there's a reason that she's in shadow behind glass, and it's not to be dramatic. It's because we couldn't afford to build another.
Really?
Yeah.
So just something as simple as that, like you couldn't afford to build.
We didn't have the there
didn't have
we had a few character models in the game. There's maybe 8 or 9 character models.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we're like, oh, we'll put her in silhouette behind a light, and people think it's noir.
And so much of it was driven by the voice performance, I feel like, too, because that it all had to, it was like a radio play in many ways still.
Yeah, we had some really good actors, and I was able to spend a lot of time with them, and the fact that I could write the stuff, direct it, and then rewrite in the room, and the fact that we had actors who were, for whatever reason, I wasn't even in the same room as them. I was on a speakerphone.
Right.
They were in a studio in New York or LA or something. I never met I don't think I met any of them.
Really? None of the actors in Bioshock you ever met in person when you were making the game?
Maybe since, but at the time I hadn't met a single one of them. Except maybe a couple people like, I played the Circus of Avis thing. Nate Wells played the Jack on the plane. A couple of people in the studio. It was community theater, in terms of the tech and the sort of time we had for it. But the actors were, we had some exceptional actors.
I will say, as doing animation on that game, that you can hide bad animation behind really good audio, and it makes the animation look better. We didn't have a tech animator. It was me. I'd never rigged characters before, and now I'm rigging characters, trying to figure out how, to get all of these characters out to the animation team. So we're very limited when it came to animation tools.
Yeah,
Since apologize to my animators.
No, but you did the big. I mean, for your first game that you rigged the Big Daddy, which is it's not an easy character to rig.
It was, we figured it out, but the tools that we had on Infinite were not the tools that we had on Bioshock. So we figured out what we could do and what we could do well, and tried to hide, kind of, put into the darkness the things that we knew we couldn't do very well. And having voice actors of that caliber that can bring those characters to life, you tend to fill in the blanks.
So tell me, friend, which one of the bitches sent you? The KGB wolf or the CIA jackal? Here's the news. Rapture isn't some sunken ship for you to plunder. And Andrew Ryan isn't a giddy socialite who can be slapped around by government muscle.
And you did get to revisit Rapture in the DLC for Infinite, and with today's technology or technology from a few years ago, I'm sure it was liberating for you guys in some ways to be able to use that tech to bring the environment and also characters to life. What was that experience like for you guys to go back and sort of revisit Rapture?
It was liberating because we got to revisit it, but we also, I think when we started, thought we'd be able to go reuse some of the old assets, and they just didn't hold up anymore compared to the Infinite assets. So we basically had to rebuild, not just rebuild everything from scratch, we had to reimagine it from scratch because, we had the ability to make it look grander and bigger, but still feel exactly like Rapture. It is a different kind of, we're making a different kind of experience than Bioshock 1, so it was tricky to make it feel like it was the same kind of game. Because it wasn't, the first one was sort of an action game, the second one was really a stealth game. The Barrel at Sea Part 2 was really a stealth game, and you're really telling the story of Elizabeth throughout those things. Yeah. So it was a different lens, but it was also cool because it allowed me to make the whole story about Elizabeth, to have her be central to the franchise from the very beginning, and she was always, she became the heart of it to me, and to have her, it was really exciting for me to make her, her heroism be something that set the events of Bioshock into motion, which eventually, saves all the little sisters. That was really gratifying, a nice way to tie the whole thing up for me.
And you probably didn't have that idea 10 years ago, right? You had to retrofit it off.
I had no idea.
He has a letter that he's addressed to himself that's 10 years old. Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, for me, it was a nice way for me to say goodbye to Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, because those two worlds together. You don't realize, or I don't think the audience realizes how much time you spend with these characters, trying to get them out and polished and into the world. And it was a good opportunity, I think, as a game developer, to kind of have that little coda at the end where you're like, okay, I get to, now I'm ready to move on to the next thing. I've had a nice, break. Like, let's seal this off, and now I'm on to the next thing.
And it was like 12 years of our lives, too. Between the very beginning of it, and it was a long time.
Well, I mean, so my daughter, who is 16 now, I did a lot of filming of her when she was 6 as a little sister. Wow. And this was not mocap, I was just running around the office. And I'm like trying to be like, now trip over the thing and pretend you die. Or trying to not traumatize a 6-year-old. Yeah, pretend you're drinking something, and and I never showed her the actual game until much later. But she, on BSI, I put her in a mocap suit and actually used her for the little sister in Paris that's running after the balloon. So that was kind of, for me, like a nice
way to connect it all together. Were there any characters on the original game that you found hardest to write? I mean, you mentioned recasting Atlas, things like that, but was there a character that was the most challenging for you, Ken?
Well, Atlas, because he was basically written completely twice. That was very, very tough, and I was very happy about the original character, and I thought I'd really done something great. And then You showed it to people, and they just hated it, and they didn't trust him. And if they didn't trust him, we were screwed.
All falls apart, yeah.
And so it was tough because we, after having gone through all the recording, actually, I had to let the actor go. It's no fault of his own, right? It was on us. He had invested in it. Tell him that it wasn't going to happen, and rewrite it from scratch. That was hard, and that was tough. And then after I finished it, I had a debate with somebody on the team who felt the accent was really, really phony. And we had an English person on the team, and he felt the accent was really phony. So at the last minute, we basically ended up doing a focus test in Ireland, to see if people bought the accent. Because the actor playing Atlas was Irish, but he was from a different part of Ireland, so he was playing a different kind of Irish accent. I don't think he was from Dublin, and Atlas sort of had a Dublin accent. And so at the last minute, I thought I was going to have to do it again.
Oh, wow.
And fortunately, the focus test came back, and people loved it.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence. I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive.
And a lot of the villains in the game felt like they were, very much tied to certain levels, and this was, you were still in an environment of levels with Bioshock, right? It wasn't just a big open world. Did that all sort of get designed together? It's like, here's the best villain that's going to fit to this environment and this theme of, this area?
Some of them work better than others. I mean, I think obviously Steinman and especially Sandra Cohen really, I think, dominate in terms of the level boss.
They are levels.
They are the levels, and some of the characters didn't hold up as well, I don't think, on the writing side. The fun thing about the characters at work, like Simon, where he had all those little displays with the scissors and the tech, like that was stuff the art team came up with to support that character. And obviously Sandra Cohen, in that level, I had this idea for this character, and as this artist, and taking Andrew Ryan's thinking to the extreme, through a lens of art, was really fun. They were really, in a lot of ways, they're sort of like more like Batman villains than they are like actual, real world villains. That they all have the Joker cares far more about the humor and the dark humor that he has, and the Riddler cares more about the riddles than he actually does about money.
Right.
The money, the crime is this afterthought.
Right.
It's the philosophy. And so these characters have a lot in common with, and there's probably a lot of inspiration taken from sort of characters like the Joker in terms of a guy like any of the characters in Bioshock, because they were really driven by their ideology, but their ideology is a mask for their sense of selves, right? This stuff is really, Cohen knows he's a hack, and he doesn't want to, he can't admit that to himself, so he has to wrap himself in all this nonsense, because the last thing he could ever do is look in the mirror and say, I'm not much of an artist.
No need to thank me for jamming the transmissions of those boors, Atlas and Ryan. Let them have their squabble. The artist, yes, the artist knows there is richer earth to till.
From the moment you boot up Bioshock, you can feel the story grab hold of you. A plane crashes at sea, a mysterious lighthouse, a sprawling city beneath the ocean. Hooking the player from the first touch without overwhelming him with convoluted RPG mechanics was key to the success of the game and the skillful ramping up of Bioshock's legendary gameplay.
Bioshock has an amazing opening sequence that I can't imagine the game without it, with the plane and sort of the crash. But I understand that didn't come online until like the very end of development. Sean, is that true?
We had a couple of really depressing playtests. We had built all these systems. We thought we were doing a good job of like giving basically people a playground to play with and things to do. And when we had a playtest, we didn't realize how bad of a job we were doing in exposing those systems to the player, because we were so in these systems and in our own heads, we had no idea that we just weren't facing them towards the player at all. So after that playtest, we took a long, cold look at what we were doing and realized that we had to introduce we were confident enough in the systems that they were going to be fun and meaningful to the player, but we really had to think about how we were going to introduce these systems to the player, and in such a way that they understand why the systems were there. Like, you can't ship a README file with the game and expect people to read it. Like, it has to be part of the experience. So the challenge is, how do you introduce people to these systems, but do it in such a way that it fits within the narrative. So we had to integrate all of these things into the story cleanly so that the player felt like it was one smooth experience. And I think the zap 'em and whack 'em thing was one of those.
And the 1-2 punch.
Yeah, the 1-2 punch that came out of that.
The plane sequence at the beginning, I heard a story that like a programmer put that together in like a day or two, and it was a very last minute thing, right?
It was, so we had done a focus test, and we had it was one of the most depressing experiences of my life, because we were very close to being finished, and it was basically giving people what essentially became the demo, and people played it, and it was in Boston, and we were sort of behind these glass windows, all these sort of Boston guys, like, this is a wicked piece of shit. You know, they hated it, and they were making fun of it, and they were saying, it's like watching some guys and dolls getting, beating each other up, and it's the stupidest thing they've ever seen. And we thought we were in pretty good shape at that point. And I remember the focus test guy was like sort of like a doctor giving me the bad news. You know, sorry, Ken, you better get your affairs in order. Right. And we all came into work the next day, and we were like, what are we going to do? And we were all pretty depressed. But I think we started talking. And as we talked, we started thinking about, what are they saying to us? What are these people saying to us? We think there's something there. How are they missing it? And we decided that maybe they didn't understand who they were and who their role in as a character, who their role in the world was, because the game at that point started with you in the ocean, floating in the ocean after the plane crash. And
the crash still was in the fiction, it just wouldn't show.
You just didn't see it, so you didn't have the voiceover saying, my parents always said I was going to do great things or whatever that. They didn't show the plane crash. We didn't establish a time period. Yeah. Because the plane is critical to establishing. You're smoking a cigarette. It's very 1960s looking. All that stuff was established. It wasn't established. So we decided we had no time and no money so we sort of came up with a script. I wrote some lines, a line, I think. Nate, one of our artists, recorded the line. Steven and Sean and those guys got to work on building this very simple sequence, which was relatively simple sequence. And then the plane crash actually happens over the Bioshock logo we already had. But we wrote a radio play behind that with, altitude of the crash. And that, I think, set the emotional, and the people screaming in terror on the plane crash, that set the emotional tenor much better and explained who the player was. And all of a sudden, we released, then I think the next real encounter we had was people playing the demo, public encounter, and all of a sudden it was a very different experience.
No, I remember even back in the day, I think we did a thing on TV where you kind of talked about it, and it was like that night, and I remember that night, like people on the forums were just like going nuts. And even though the game had a lot of press attention, when people finally got to play it and go through that sequence, I just remember there was this mass sort of excitement around it, and then the game shipped only a few weeks after that, right, or a month after that?
A week later, or a few days later.
It's amazing, like now, to hear that, like literally like a month before the game came out, like the plane sequence came online or something. I mean, it was that late. Right?
Well, we still had to go through certification and all that.
Yeah, but it's like within.
It wasn't far. It wasn't far. It was really last minute, and it was one of those things where like you really shouldn't be putting in content that late. Yeah. But we felt it. We were so close to having something good that we just rolled the dice on it, and we worked really hard on it. Like we worked really hard. I remember how much time I spent on just that recorded of altitude. I can still hear the different version of that in my head because we spent so much time on that stuff. And these guys were working on getting the animations right and the
scene was shot in engine, but we decided to pre-render it so that we had to do less QA on it. Right. It wasn't going to be some like weird streaming error or crash error. Wow. It was just like, we're just going to show the video, yeah.
And it's interesting because once you start in the ocean, we had this experience of testing a lot with the water effects and how beautiful Steven's water effects were. People didn't realize they were out of a cutscene at that point. And so they would just sit there and stare, and then they pick up the controller. And they pick up the controller, and all of a sudden they realize they were controlling things. But that, as Sean said, that part of the plane is not actually interactive. It was done in the engine, but we just filmed it.
Now, as people were playing through the game and you were testing it, I'm sure there was debate about, when would you introduce this plasmids, what would the ramp be? Did that change at all, sort of as you got towards the end of development, about like, we're going to give people the gun at this point, or it's like, we're going to trigger these plasmids at this point? Like, how did that work?
So, like, we moved guns around. Like, for instance, there was a big debate about, originally you found a gun in the lighthouse, a pistol in the lighthouse.
Oh,
in the very
right
beginning.
there,
And because it's a shooter, right? Like, what the hell? And we had a lot of debates about it, and I feel that it was important that we didn't do that, because the fact that you sort of go through a lot of the experience without having the distraction of a gun is important to getting you immersed in the world. Because, you know, when you have all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But you don't have the hammer. So you just sort of had to take in the world and have that feeling of fear. And like, I know when you saw that splicer bounding around on the ceiling, that you couldn't do anything about it. And that had even though that's
those are those moments, right? Like I remember when I played Unreal for the first time, where it's like you're trapped and there's a monster and you can't do it, and the lights go out. It's like that's the moment with the splicer where you're like, I want to do something but I can't, and that evokes an emotion.
I remember we kept, you know, moving where the machine gun appeared around and where various plasmids appeared around. It was a real, it's a real fine-tuning process.
Yeah, and it gave us an opportunity, like especially with the shotgun, to really present the weapons, like put some space between them.
It's a moment when you finally.
Yeah, I think
we get the shotgun Paul sequence.
Paul Hellquist was he put the sequence together for the when you see the shotgun laying in the pool of light. Like every game developer knows what that means. You know the minute you pick that thing up, something's going to happen. But it was still a very effective way, as I'm remembering it, to, oh look, I've been waiting for this thing, I'm going to pick it up, and now you have an immediate opportunity to use it. But you know, at the same time, we're trying to ramp up the tension level by having the splicers kind of on the outside of the light, so you can't really see them, and then coming in one at a time and attacking you.
Yeah. And we had very few tools to really control how the splicers acted. So how they were set up and how the environment was lit was really important. You know,
well, there's even other things like when you get the TK plasmid. I don't think we had a lot of physical space and opportunity and time to really present that. So we came up with the narrative that, you know, it was the doctor's office and he used TK to practice tennis. And we had the turret in there that threw tennis balls at you. So if you wanted to, you could catch the tennis balls and throw them, and you could knock things down. I think it revealed pickups that you could then, you know, pull to yourself with TK. But we're always trying to think of like little backstories that we could do. It doesn't have to be as involved as the shotgun ambush. Sometimes it's just, oh, let's take a grenade turret and turn it into a tennis ball turret.
Because we want to, because I remember like the impulse was, you know, I've been to dentist office, and there's always some like weird aspect of the dentist personality they always want to get through their office, you know. They always have to have their hobby featured in some way, and so we saw an opportunity there to both feature this, he's a tennis nut, and teach TK at the same time.
And the